Can I say, first of all, what a real pleasure it is to be here today at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy with so many people who are both politicians, leaders, students, lecturers, people who are studying international relations. And I want to congratulate the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy because you have shown that soft power is more important than what we are now seeing too often around the world, the exercise of hard power. But you're also showing that it's important that nations build respect, that they cooperate with each other, that they are in a position to build trust with each other. And I'm very pleased that the former Prime Minister of Armenia is here, the former Prime Minister of Guinea-Bissau, my old friend, the former President of Ghana, John Kafur, I think is speaking to you tomorrow, and you therefore have a very excellent programme. My theme is the trends in the global economy and how it affects the opportunities for building trust and cooperation between countries. And I think it's particularly relevant because yesterday President Trump announced that he was going to impose tariffs on steel and aluminium. And this is probably the biggest lapse into protectionism that we have seen from America for more than 50 years. And it is therefore a very significant event in the world, and I want to show why it is something that we must look to change over the next few years. My theme about global economics reminds me that the great physicist, the great scientist Albert Einstein, who studied here in Germany, he used to go around the different countries of Europe in his later years in the 1950s, before he died, when he'd given up on all the great work he'd done on physics and science and wanted to talk about exactly the themes that we're talking about today, global cooperation, the trends in the global economy, how we could build a better world. And he used to publish a book almost every year about his views of how global society should develop. And he would embark on a speaking tour around my country, Britain, and other countries as well. And when he came to Britain, because the distances between places are not that great, what he would do is he would hire a chauffeur to advertise, to go around these different towns of Britain, advertising his book, giving a set speech, 15 minutes he would give in one place, then the chauffeur would come with him, drive him, the driver would take him to the next place, then the next place, and the next place. So he could do about 6 or 7 speeches in a day in different towns and cities of Britain. And he would do that for several weeks with him and his driver, his chauffeur, the only people going around the country. Of course, the only problem was he gave exactly the same speech wherever he went, a 15-minute speech. And one night his chauffeur, Einstein, of course, was an old man, and this was in the days before the television age when people knew people's faces. The chauffeur said to him, "Look, Mr. Einstein, I've heard your speech so many times. I know it off by heart. You are looking tired this evening. Why don't you sit in the audience where I normally sit in the front row, and I will give the speech and nobody will be any the wiser." And so that night Einstein, he was in his 80s, was very tired, so he said, "Okay, I'll let you do this." The chauffeur had memorized the speech, came up and was introduced, gave the speech, did it absolutely brilliant, word for word, sat down to great applause, and then was about to leave the stage so that we're going to go to the next place, so he would drive Einstein onwards, when suddenly the chairman for the night said, "Are there any questions?" So the chauffeur is up on the stage, Einstein is in the audience, and the first question, of course, is a scientific one. "Mr. Einstein, what is the relationship between the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics?" And this chauffeur, the driver, is rooted to the spot, hasn't a clue what to say, doesn't know how to answer the question, looks at Einstein for inspiration in the audience sitting in the front row and gets none, and then he says suddenly, "Look, ladies and gentlemen, this question is so simple and it is so straightforward. I'm going to ask my chauffeur to come up from the audience and answer the question." Now, I'm not going to give a set speech. I'm not going to talk simply about the issues that I talk about on other occasions. I want to talk about something specific to what you are actually doing. Today, you've got the Global Tourism Conference in Berlin. The numbers of people who are traveling between countries as tourists has grown dramatically over recent years. So you see increasing contact and increasing communication between peoples. as a result of tourism. It's gone from 500 million to 1 billion at the turn of this by 2010 to 1.3 billion now, to 1.7 billion they expect in the 2020s or 2030, and it will certainly rise to 2 billion, mainly because people in Asia are traveling far more from their country of origins for holidays and for tourist visits. And so you will see this increased connection happening around the world, more and more people traveling from one country to another. Students. 1 million students a few years ago were studying in countries other than their own. It rose to 2 million by 2010. It's now 3 million, rising to 4 million. It'll be 6 or 7 million. And again, you're seeing this increased connection between cultures, continents and countries simply by student exchanges, which are becoming very popular and very important to someone's education. Migration itself, very controversial, but very important. The numbers of people who are traveling and staying in the country that is not the country of their birth has risen to something in the order of 250 million. It will rise substantially in the years to come, particularly because of immigration to Europe from Africa that will become greater than immigration from the south of America into America, which has been the biggest source of Western migration in recent years. And again, you are seeing huge trends, particularly in people coming from poor countries to rich countries. 20 million 50 years ago, 100 million now staying in countries that are richer countries, having come from poorer countries. And you're seeing this increasing connectivity, this increasing contact and communication. And of course, mobile communications, as you know, makes it possible for someone in one continent to talk to someone instantly in another continent, and it makes it possible for people to find common bonds between themselves, no matter where they stay, no matter how far away they are from each other, no matter what their circumstances is in different countries, and the world is changing fast as a result of this. Now, Adam Smith was the famous economist, wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations. Anybody who studies economics will know about Adam Smith and about the work that he did in pioneering this idea of trade as the engine of growth. I actually come and was brought up in the town where Adam Smith was born, Kirkcaldy in Fife in Scotland. And Adam Smith wrote all his books there, the singularly important book, The Wealth of Nations, and then the other book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And if you come to the town where I was at school and where I grew up, you'll find it's unique in the sense it's got a 2-mile-long esplanade. So from the town, you look out on sea with this huge esplanade going on for 2 miles and then more, actually, round the coast. And so Adam Smith grew up in this town, and he was the son of the customs officer, and he looked out on the sea in the north, towards the North Sea, and he could see what was changing his town. It was ships coming in and out from different parts of Europe, 100 ships a year coming in and out and building trade between Britain, in this case, and the continent, the mainland of Europe. And that's why he wrote The Wealth of Nations. He could see that trade was going to transform the possibilities of economic growth and prosperity, and that contact between one country and another was going to make the biggest difference to the possibilities for economic growth. And in that way, Britain pioneered the Industrial Revolution in the world. It was built on trade between different countries of the world that Britain was able to pioneer. But Adam Smith also wrote another book that he always thought was more important than the famous book, The Wealth of Nations. And it was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And Adam Smith lived in this town, which was a small town, close-knit, and he could walk from his house to the school, to the church, to all the different community institutions in the area, and he thought of his place as a community. He didn't think of the world just in terms of markets, he thought of the world in terms of communities. And he developed this idea of the circle of empathy, the circle, you could call it, of sympathy, that you had in your circle of sympathy your nearest neighbors, your relatives, the people you were very close to it. And he asked himself, well, why was it that if you're a human being, and there are many millions of human beings in different parts of the world, you didn't feel any sympathy for people in Asia or people in Latin America or people in Europe, and yet you had sympathy towards your fellow human beings expressed through your sympathy for your relatives? And he asked the question, why is it if there was an earthquake in China and a disaster there, you would be more concerned about a cut in your finger than you would be about the lives of thousands of people who were dying as a result of a disaster in a far-off land? And he said the answer is that as we know more and as we communicate more and as we are more educated, this circle of empathy will expand. So the circle of empathy is restricted to our relatives and friends as things stood in the 18th century. But he predicted that as we had more information about people who lived in other countries, as we were able to communicate with them more, he didn't anticipate the internet, but he anticipated travel and he anticipated people moving from one country to another. And as our moral sense became more sophisticated through education, that we would build connections with the rest of the world, even from a local small town in the north of the continent of Europe into Asia, America, and beyond. And so Adam Smith's idea is still relevant. The circle of empathy could and should continue to expand. As we know more about people, as we communicate with them, and as we educate our moral sense about the importance of our interconnectivity with people and countries and continents, then that circle of moral empathy and sympathy, whatever word you use, empathy or sympathy, can expand. And of course, that is what lies behind the theory that has brought into being the Institute for Cultural Democracy, that as we understand each other better, as we know more about each other, as we find more about each other, and as we are able to communicate, and as we educate ourselves about each other, then we will have a far more cooperative world. We will be more altruistic, more cooperative, rather than more repetitive, aggressive, and competitive, if we can develop that circle of empathy. But when you look around the global economy today, and this is the point I really want to make, and then show how we can answer this, the opposite seems to be true. We have just seen the big announcements of protectionism. And it's not just the Americans banning steel and aluminium and trying to suggest that it's America first, and in a sense, despite what he says, America only. We have seen the failure to deliver a world trade agreement. The first time for 50 years that there is no world trade agreement in place. We had trade agreements from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and now we don't have one. We've seen America pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We know it's difficult now to imagine a European-American trade deal as people had hoped for over a period of time. And so protectionism is on the rise. And it seems to be every country for themselves in this new atmosphere of trade protectionism. And that is a feature of the modern economy that you would not have predicted 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And the second thing that has happened that seems to confound what Adam Smith said, that we would understand each other better, that we'd build better relationships, that we would be able to educate people about the advantages of cooperation, is of course what we're also seeing, the growth, particularly in Europe at the moment, of populism. It's true of America, it's true of other countries outside Europe, but it's particularly true of what we are seeing in Europe. So we've got protectionism, which is economic action that is taken to isolate countries one from another and separate them off, as if the competitive advantage lies in not having trade cooperation. And we now have populism. And populism is expressed last Sunday in the Italian elections, where the majority of people seem to vote for anti-European parties. It seemed to be expressed in Brexit, where sadly my own country voted that they wanted to leave the European Union. It's seen in the rise in Germany, this country, of what's called the AfD, the party of the very far right in Germany, which is particularly hostile to Europe and to immigration. But it's seen right across Europe, whether it's the illiberal democracies of Hungary and Poland, and what is happening in some parts of Eastern Europe, and indeed further on into Russia, but it's also seen in the protectionist support, the support for populist and protectionist parties from Norway to France to Spain. And this is a feature of modern Europe that we've got to take into account if we're looking at what the future holds for us. So on the one hand, we have protectionism, On the other hand, we have what you might call isolationist populism or nationalism, or you have a rise of xenophobic views. And these are two factors that seem to suggest that all the hope that we had and Adam Smith had about greater cooperation between countries is being undermined by what's happening. I want to suggest that both the protectionism and the populism are symptoms of what you might say is a more fundamental issue that we've got to address. They are both symptoms of people's response to global change, of people's worries and fears and anxieties about what is happening to their jobs, their livelihoods, their families, their cultures, their countries, as a result of the spread of global economic change over recent years. And it's because people feel that globalization is a runaway train, out of control and uncontrollable, because they feel there is nothing they can do about it but demand to take back control. That was the slogan in the European referendum in Britain, and it's the slogan of many populist parties across Europe, and in a sense the slogan of Donald Trump in America. And so you've got the rise of populism, the rise of protectionism, and that is a symptom of this bigger problem that people do not know how to handle what has been the most important feature of world economics in recent years, and that is globalization. Now, what is it that we are talking about here, and what can we actually do about it? In practice, economic globalization is to transcend the national flows of capital that we used to have in the past by global flows of capital. So more and more investment in one country is made by someone from another country, and capital is circulating across the world where it used to be restricted by national boundaries. And it's secondly the global sourcing of goods and services. And so in the past, if you bought a good 50 years ago or had a service delivered to you in your own country, it would normally have been manufactured or produced, or at least mainly produced in your own country. Now, the global sourcing of your computers, of your telephones, of your clothes, that is the feature of the modern economy. And these two major trends, the global flow of capital, which means that nation states are no longer feeling that they are in control of their own affairs, and the global sourcing of goods and services, which make people worry that their manufacturing job in one country is going to be taken by a worker in another country. These are the two main features of economic globalization. And it has caused greater inequality, and it has caused a reshuffling of the pack. You are seeing with globalization, of course, the rise of a global middle class. So the global middle class, which is people who've got more than $10 a day, according to some of the surveys, was 1 billion a few years ago. It's now 2 billion. It's going to grow to 3 billion and 4 billion. But that is mainly people joining the middle class from Asia. That is industrial workers who are now earning sufficient wages, whether they're in high-tech or low-tech, in China and in Asian countries, who are joining the global middle class. But this is seen by many people in America and the West to be at the expense of the stagnation of wages amongst the middle class in America, the industrial working class in Europe, who feel that they are losing out as a result of the global sourcing of goods and services and the global flows of capital. So the world is changing fast, and people are worried about what is to happen to them. And we have got to somehow explain to them that these trends are not only trends that we cannot reverse, but these are forces that we can bring under control. So the world is increasingly going to be multipolar. Nobody doubts that. And when you look at the economic trends, not just till now, but in the years to come, then Asia will clearly become a far more important part of the global economy, but so too will Latin America, and so too potentially over time may Africa. So until the global financial crisis in 2008-9, more than 50% of everything that was produced in the world, more than 50% of everything that was invested in the world, more than 50% of everything that was traded in the world, more than 50% of everything that was consumed in the world was consumed in the West. It was consumed in America and Europe, America or Europe. And more than 50% gave the West this greater hegemony in terms of the running of the world economy. Since the global financial crisis, as a result of the rise of China over 30 years and the rise of other countries, sometimes called the BRICS, Brazil and South Africa are included, but India, of course, is important to this. But you've also had the rise of Asian economies in Korea, Thailand, Philippines, and all, Vietnam now rising. So these are countries that are increasingly becoming a central part of the world economy. And over time, Asia will become 50% of the world economy. And over time, the rise of China will be such that it will not only be the biggest economy in terms of size, but the standards of living of the Chinese people, which are a quarter of those of America at the moment, will rise substantially. And we will have, perhaps militarily, still a unipolar world in the sense that more than half of defense expenditure, military expenditure, is by America. But economically, this is a multipolar world already, and it will increasingly be a multipolar world in the years to come. It is also, of course, a multidimensional world, because in the past, if we were talking about relations between countries, we would think only of governments and states. Now, of course, it's multidimensional, multi-tier. We talk about not just countries and the governments, we talk about countries and the businesses, their NGOs, their mayors and their cities, and we talk about individuals themselves through the internet and through Twitter and everything else being able to express themselves. So what was once a unipolar world where governments talk to governments as the main source of international relations is now a multipolar and multidimensional world in which not only are there economic rivals to America particularly, but to the West, and this will increase over time. But of course, there are also many dimensions in which power is exercised, and it's not simply by governments anymore. But the second feature of this new world is not just its multipolarity, is something we forget at our peril. It's interdependence. So do not forget that what has developed over the last 30 or 40 years is a global supply chain, global companies, global institutions, global contact in such a way that we bind the different countries of the world together. And if you think of this concept, the global supply chain, just think of what it means. It means for Apple, for example, that while they design their products in America and say proudly on their products that they were designed in America, the materials, the raw materials for them come from Taiwan, they come from Mongolia, they come from Vietnam. The assembly is done in China, where more than 1 million workers are employed by this company Foxconn, which is the major supplier to Apple. And Apple can only keep its prices as they are and make the profits that they do as a result of having a global supply chain. They do not choose to assemble many of their products in the country in which they innovate. They assemble it as part of a global supply chain, so the person who does the research is in one place, the person who does the innovation and turns it into a design is in another place, the person who's actually bringing the components together comes from different places, and then you have the assembly taking place in another place. And why this protectionism cannot work is simply the economic reality that we have a global supply chain. So if you're a country and you're importing goods and you put a stop on your imports, as America proposes to do, then that will also affect their exports. Because a very substantial proportion of American exports are made up of components that come from imports. In America's case, it's probably about 15% of their exports originate from imports into America. In the case of a country like Britain or the European Union, it's maybe 20 or 30%. In the case of a country like Ireland, which is very internationalist in the way it operates, it's nearly 50%. But if you try to cut off your imports and you end up cutting off your exports, you're in a very bad position as a result. If at the same time you cut off your imports and cut yourself out of the global supply chain, then you become unprofitable and unsuccessful as a company. And the reason why there is so much reaction against what Mr. Trump has proposed yesterday, despite the fact he's also made gestures to North Korea, and it looks like there may be some possibilities of some peaceful diplomacy there, which is all to the good. But the reason there is a huge reaction from business, his economic advisor has resigned, companies are complaining about what he does, Republican senators are complaining, is they understand the reality of modern interdependence. that a global supply chain means that if you cut off your imports, you hurt your exports. A global supply chain means if you cut off your imports, you cut yourself out of the global supply chain. If you cut yourself out of the global supply chain, you cut yourself away from the chances of prosperity in the future. So maybe 100 years ago, it might have been easy to protect yourself against another country because the consequences were not as great. Now, people facing a global supply chain realize that the apples of this world that bring so much prosperity to America will actually be harshly affected as a result of the tariffs that then mean that they are in a problem. If China decides, for example, to have sanctions against America, no doubt they will choose companies like Apple, just like Europe is planning sanctions against America, and they're choosing things that embarrass the American senators in their own seats. Harley-Davidson motorbikes they're going to put tariffs on. They're going to put tariffs on whiskey and things like that from Europe. And that really does affect Scotland, my country. And you then see a trade war because one retaliates, then the other retaliates, then the other retaliates. And protectionism is actually against the modern economic reality that I've just been describing, that we are part of a global supply chain. And the real question is not how you abandon the global supply chain and global cooperation in economics, which is almost impossible now to do, and more countries want to be part of that global supply chain, including, it looks, North Korea. The real question is how you build on that cooperation. And here are my last remarks to you about how we build more effective global cooperation. There have been huge setbacks in recent years. The World Trade Organization, as I say, is not working effectively. We have a climate change agreement, but America has pulled out of it. We have little cooperation on arms reductions and nuclear strategies between countries. And indeed, the threshold for nuclear conflict has become more difficult in the last few weeks as Russia has announced new nuclear weapons that it feels it can use, and America has announced that great power rivalry, not terrorism, is its biggest problem, and that they're prepared to consider using nuclear weapons to deal with conventional weapons as shot and used by an enemy. And therefore, the chances of escalation are actually growing and not reducing as a result. But there are also good examples of where cooperation can work, and that is what I urge you to build upon. The examples are these: the G20, which I chaired in 2009 when we had the financial crisis. We managed to inject $1 trillion of resources into the world economy and stopped a recession becoming a depression. And this was an example of how the world could come together. We all came together in London and made decisions jointly and collectively about how we could escape recession. And as a result, the economy went back to growth very quickly. While climate change has been set back by what President Trump has decided to come out of the Paris Agreement, there's no doubt that from the period in 2009, when we couldn't get a climate change agreement, to Paris when we did, global cooperation did work. And even although America is outside the climate change deal at the moment, American cities are inside, American businesses are inside, and the cooperation between American businesses and cities and the rest of the world is still growing despite what President Trump has done. And I want to give you one example of where global cooperation can work effectively, and we can show that Adam Smith's vision of this circle of moral empathy can actually work, can be done in our times. If you take global health, we managed 15 years ago to create the Global Health Fund for tuberculosis, for AIDS, for malaria. That was a major advance, and its last replenishment, I think, got $13 billion pledged to it by all the different countries of the world. So keen are they to achieve the Millennium and Sustainable Development Goals that we reduce infant mortality, maternal mortality, we eradicate preventable diseases, and therefore it's a good example of cooperation that continues despite some of the trends to protectionism. The Global Vaccination Initiative. You know that 500 million children have been vaccinated as a result of a global initiative that relied on what was called the International Finance Facility on Immunization, raising funds in the private sector so we could front-load vaccinations and immunization of children in the poorest countries of the world. And 5 million lives at least have been saved just by that one initiative. Now we have a new initiative, Take Global Education, vastly neglected. You know, today there are 260 million children who are not going to be at school. 260 million school-aged children are being denied an education in different parts of the world. You know, there are 400 million children who will finish their education at 10, 11, or at best 12 and never be back in a school again. And you know, there are 800 million children across the world who finish their education early because of poverty, because they are unable to stay on in school because education is neither provided or is not of a high enough quality, and they will not have the qualifications necessary for the labour force of the world. And that is the situation of education today, that we promised in the Sustainable Development Goals that every child would be in education. We now have a situation where even in 2030, the timetable we have is to get to that by 2030, we will still have 800 million children who will not be getting a decent education and 200 million children not at school. So we have a plan. It's called the International Finance Facility for Education. I'm the UN Global Envoy on this. We are trying to win support from countries to invest in education. Only 9 billion is invested a year in aid on education to get kids in poorer countries to school. Only 9 billion, which is roughly less than $10 per child in Africa and Asia. Not enough even in aid to provide for one textbook for a child. And our plan is to double that aid, and we need countries like Germany and France and the European Union as a whole, the Scandinavian countries, Britain, Canada. If America would join, great. China, Korea, countries that can afford to do this, to sponsor what would be a major new initiative in education. Of course, the advantages are this, that education is also the means by which we promote cultural understanding between children. You know, in Lebanon, which is the most divided country politically in the world, where they have Shia and Sunni and Christian fighting against each other for prominence in the governments that they often can never form because of the divisions that they have at least agreed to help all Syrian refugees. And we've got 300,000 Syrian refugees in school in Lebanon. And at the same time, they've agreed a curriculum which teaches people in these Lebanese schools the virtues of coexistence and how different religions have different attributes and different assets, and we should respect all of them. So we need to show that international cooperation can work. There is a practical example of what can be done, which is to create this year at the G20 in November in Argentina, the International Finance Facility for Education. And if we can show that cooperation can work where countries come together for a global good, like education, as we did on health, then we can show that those people who say that international cooperation cannot work, that it's every nation for himself or itself, that it's isolationism that is a better policy than cooperation, we can prove that these are wrong. But that will need not just governments, it will need you, it will need businesses, it will need civil society, it will need NGOs, as well as governments, to say that we need to show that global cooperation can work. Now, part of your conference, and this is where I end, has been to discuss how nations brand themselves and how they present themselves to the world. And part of what the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy argues is that nations should be honest about what they are, rather than simply create propaganda through their television stations or radio stations, giving a false impression of how liberal or how tolerant or how good they are in what they do for the rest of the world. And nations often make mistakes when they try to brand themselves. I remember when we came into government in 1997, and I was Chancellor Fisher, the finance minister, there was an attempt to rebrand Britain, and it was called Cool Britannia. And then we talked about young Britain. Just like Australia called itself a young country, we started to call Britain a young country. And of course, it was totally against the grain, because people think of Britain as historically a very stable country over centuries, and one of its virtues is its institutions and its values and its belief in liberty and tolerance and fairness and social responsibility over a long period of time. And they don't think of us, and never would, as one of the youngest countries in the world. Or, to be honest, given what happened, they didn't think we were that cool either. And so nations' brandings can go wrong, and you can make a mistake in how you present yourself to the world. And of course, some countries have been incredibly successful in doing so. Just think of Germany. After the Second World War, people doubting whether Jewish people could stay in the country, and now one of the highest rates of immigration of Jewish people is into Germany because of the laws that Germany has passed and its determination to blank out and to end the memory of its past by doing the right things to promote cross-cultural cooperation. Now, just end with one story, America. And it's fascinating because think of the biggest branding that has ever been done, in a sense, and that is the Statue of Liberty. And that text, Lazarus, bring me your huddled masses yearning to be free. And that sent out a message about America, that it was tolerant, that it was open, that it was receiving of people who came from some of the poorest parts of the world, and that it was a country that you could think of as a country of the future because so many different ethnic groups would be prepared and feel safe to come to America. Well, the true story of the Statue of Liberty is that when it was first put up in America in the 1880s, it was nothing to do with bring me your huddled masses. There was no text from Lazarus. There was no mention of being tolerant of immigration. In fact, America in the 1880s received the Statue of Liberty as a gift from France, and there was in America very aggressive anti-immigration policies for people from Southern Europe, people who were Jews, people who were from other races. America actually was practicing at that time some of the most intolerant policies in the world, rather like South Africa had done in the last 50 years before the end of apartheid. It was only in the 20th century, at the beginning of it, that this text, bring me your huddled masses, was put inside the Statue of Liberty, hidden away by someone who was a supporter of the poet and wanted the poet to be better known. And it was only in the 1950s that the text was put on the near the front of the statue and publicized as a result. And it was over these 50 years, from 1900 to 1950, that America became a more tolerant, more open, more receiving society, more welcoming society for people. And so the images of countries can change over time. And just think of Canada. Canada had a White Canada policy, effectively, and now it is seen around the world as a country that is the most tolerant of immigrants. And 40% of the population of Toronto in Canada were born in other countries, one of the cities in the world that is the most diverse and the most ethnically mixed. And the Prime Minister of Canada, you saw him welcoming Syrian refugees into his country, a total change in a country. And what I've learned is that what really matters about a country and why people will visit it, why people as tourists, why people will want to come as students, why people will want to invest in it, why people will want to trade in that country, why it will be attractive to people around the world as an emblem of something that they think is important, is if a country is outward looking, if a country is tolerant, if a country is respectful of human rights, and is a country that is prepared to cooperate with other countries. So not only are the economic realities of this world pointing to the need for greater international cooperation and a rejection of the protectionism and the anti-globalization themes that suggest you should restrict and be xenophobic about people coming to your country, but also the way cities, and it's not just countries, the way cities and communities will present themselves to the world to best effect and will become magnets for people, not repel people, will become attractive to people, is when you promote human rights, when you're respectful of other religions and other identities, when you are outward looking in your attitudes as well as tolerant, and when you practice cooperation. My view is that that is the way forward. And if the Institute for Cultural Democracy is going to progress, as it will in the next few years, it is by showing people the benefits of international cooperation, the merits of cultural understanding as the basis of cooperation, and of course the strength that countries come from presenting the right image to the world, the one that will actually stick and will, as Adam Smith said, have resonance right across the centuries, be outward looking, be tolerant, be humane, be respectful of human rights. Thank you very much.